Okay, so hopefully you are all here to be a part of the 2017 National Summit on Youth Homelessness by the National Network for Youth. And this is our Hill Day preparation for summit participants specifically. So this will all be geared specifically towards this 2017 year in Washington, D.C. and our policy agenda. Okay, so housekeeping questions, and asking questions. So we will only be taking written questions in the chat box over there in the panel to the right-hand side. Please type your questions into our chat box at any time during the presentation. I will try to get to them when there's an appropriate pause or if it seems like it's very urgent. Also, be sure to send your question to everyone, I believe is the way GoToMeeting has it worded, or to all, the public option is, so that everyone can see when there's been a question submitted. Chances are, if you're wanting to ask a question, there's somebody else out there that wants to ask the same question. So we will either I will either respond in writing or over the phone auditorily. What are we talking about today? We are talking about contacting your federal representative, being fully prepared for your visit to meet with that representative, what our specific policy asks for this year are going to look like in this early part of 2017, how to invite your federal representatives and or their staff from your local district to visit your organization at home, and then how to appropriately follow up. So let's start with contacting your federal representative. You always want to call your congressional offices directly. You can find all of that information on senate.gov and clerk.house.gov. And I can type that, let me see, I can get that into the chat box for you. There you go. You can let them know that you are a constituent from their district, that you're going to be in Washington, D.C. for this particular summit. You want to use the name of the summit as well, and that you want to meet with them about youth homelessness issues. So when you're talking to them and setting up the meeting, you really want to be specific that you are trying to discuss a local issue and that specifically is youth homelessness. This will key them in that if the representative isn't available on that day, that they will make sure to set you up with the staff or the aide who handles youth homelessness policy particularly. There we go. So in preparing for your visit, you want to coordinate your visits with others that are going to be visiting Washington, D.C. from your state who are also participating. The power in numbers really can't be overstated. The more people that you can pack into one of the small meeting rooms, if it happens to be one of the small meeting rooms, the more powerful that message really becomes. There's something to be said about having a standing room only meeting for an issue as important as this. Of course, if you don't know who else from your state or from your district is planning to attend, go ahead and email us. You can see that I believe if you highlight that link on your screen, you should be able to get to that email address. Let me bring it up again. So it's Julene Heaney at outlook.com. And then the subject should be Hill Meetings questions. Hopefully folks can see that. As I said, these slides will be available to all of you, so you'll be able to find that as well. But she will actually be able to go through our log of everybody that's coming to the summit and be able to pair you up and put you specifically in communication with other folks from your area. Also, please come prepared with all of your talking points. We're going to go through a bunch of those talking points today. And if you have not received the resource guide for 2017, your Hill visits, let us know, and we will make sure that you receive a copy of that as well. Of course, fact sheets and whatnot will all be available as they have been in the past. And so know exactly what points you're going to want to communicate, and be prepared with examples or data specifically from your area to underscore your points. Especially if you're meeting with House representatives, it's important to have that really, really local, in their backyard example and data. And then, of course, bring all of your program information, any pamphlets that you have, and research that your organization may have put out recently. So in the meeting, what you really want to focus on communicating, there are a number of steps, as you can see here. Thank yous are going to be really important and will go a long way. So always start the meeting by thanking them for taking the time to meet with you. These folks are super busy, as you can imagine, especially in a transitional time like we have right now. Note your expertise, because it can't, you really can't go wrong in showing the amount of experience that you have in working in this field. They don't have that expertise, and so it's important to remember that even though they are leaders in a position of power, in a position to make certain decisions, they are not the expert in the room as soon as you walk into the room. You are now the expert on youth homelessness when you're talking to them, and that was something that I think is really important to convey to all of you. You are the experts, and you are the only ones that can explain your organization to them. So explain how it affects the local community, make all of your points, and clearly articulate your asks. You'll see later in the presentation that we have a number of asks laid out that are very specific as to what you want your U.S. representative to do. You should always feel free, and we encourage you to invite your United States representative to visit your program when they are on recess. For example, this week, they're all, well, because of President's Week, they should all be in recess at home in your district, in your local district. Whether they're working or not is a completely different story. So again, after you wrap up, never underestimate the power of small talk. If they want to talk to you about, you know, a new building that's being contemplated in your neighborhood, don't shy away from that. And it's definitely not them trying to give you just small talk that doesn't matter, right? If you can engage in that small talk and it shows that you really are a part of their community, then it gives them a connection to you and a reason to want to listen beyond just the importance of the issue itself. So as we said, once you are completed with your meeting, make sure to thank them for the meeting again, and then ask for their business card so that you can follow up. So what is follow-up? How does that really look? We want to make sure that we send an email to everyone that you met with specific information that you said you would follow up with in your meeting. There's a lot of times that an aide or a legislator may not quite understand what you're talking about, and if you say, hey, you know what, I've got a fact sheet about that, I'll make sure to shoot it over to you after the meeting. Well, make sure that you actually do that. It's really powerful, and it keeps that aide or that representative thinking about you and your program. So invite that U.S. representative and their staff to visit your program again in the follow-up email, including specific potential dates. So see when kind of they might be on recess or back in their home states. or if you're going to have a specific event, for example, if there's going to be a groundbreaking event, that would be something that they may have interest in being at, especially if it's going to be high profile, if you've got local media that's going to be around. That is useful for them come next election, right? So remind them what your asks were, and then urge them to take the actions that you've already articulated in your meeting, and then thank them one more time for the meeting. So what are our policy asks this year? So because of the way that this year has gone and the fact that it's a transitional period and the inaction that was taken at the end of last year, we do still have Fiscal Year 2017 funding asks. So we're going to run through these quickly. The background is that there were budget caps lifted for FY16. When I say FY, that means fiscal year, and FY17, which equated to more funding for domestic and defense policy and laws and programs, sorry. The President's FY17 budget was released, this was under Obama, was released in February of 2016. There was a continuing resolution, or you might hear people in the media and the news say a CR, funded the government through April of this year. So that's what, that's why we are still having asks for FY17. So Congress currently needs to pass the continuing resolution or omnibus or cromnibus, the combination, by April 28th for the rest of quote-unquote FY17. So what's our specific ask? We want legislators to appropriate the Senate's proposed funding levels in the final funding bill for FY17 and the House's proposed demonstration grant. So what are those specifically? We asked for, it was specified $119.21 million for Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funded programs. The Education for Homeless Children and Youth program at $77 million, and Housing and Urban Development McKinney Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project through the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Assistance Program in the amount of $40 million. Now, currently, this is the 10 communities that I know a lot of you have been hearing about that were previously appropriated for $33 million. So the talking point for each request for that $119.21 million for HYA funded programs, this is the same level that was appropriated in FY16, so it's a pretty easy argument to say, hey, this is what's been happening, let's continue this on for right now. And then you'll see later that we will eventually be able to advocate more strongly for an increase in that amount. You want to point out that the RHY program targets youth-specific housing and services to communities, right? Because not all programs that provide housing assistance do target youth-specific housing. And so it's really important to point out that that these programs have been targeting this population and have been doing it successfully for 40 years on very little money. The programs that we're advocating for are on the front lines of preventing and serving victims of human trafficking. Human trafficking is a big buzzword right now, and will really help to kind of raise those flags and make sure that everybody's really paying attention to the issues. We know of very few folks that don't care about human trafficking and youth homelessness. And so if we can show the connection between the two and how our programs are truly on the front lines of preventing and serving those victims, then it gets a lot of buy-in. There's a lot of camaraderie behind that. So these programs prevent youth from abusing substances, especially heroin and opioids. as well as referring youth to substance abuse intervention programs. And this is another one that's really important given the current legislative landscape. There's a lot of attention being brought to heroin and opioids. So we want to kind of tune in to those issues that are really important to the folks that we're going to be talking to. So as far as the $77 million for those Education for Homeless Children and Youth programs, EHCY was one of the few programs to receive an increase. And we were really, really excited about that. It was actually authorized to be up to $85 million. So the increase was from $70 million up to the $77. And in 2014 to 2015 school year, we want to point out that public schools identified over 95,000 unaccompanied homeless youth. It's really, again, important to be able to point to the vastness of the issue or the challenge that we're speaking on. And we also, in pointing out that data point, we really want to be precise in educating the legislator that when we're talking about public school and their number identified, the majority of those youth who are being identified as unaccompanied homeless youth are minors, right? Because the public schools, while we do see some carryover into adult education, there are far less folks actually enrolled in adult education than public schools. And so it's important to point out that we all understand that that is a vast undercount, given that it's really only capturing that 12 to 18-year-old range. Okay, moving on. So when we're talking about those youth homelessness demonstration projects through Housing and Urban Development, you'll hear me say HUD a lot. That's what I'm referring to. Youth really truly need a continuum of housing and services that's appropriate and relevant to their development stages. So we want to make sure that we're really targeting the HUD housing assistance and homelessness assistance through those youth homelessness demonstration projects to developmentally appropriate services. So this funding would give HUD the ability to fund a second round of demonstration projects, which would be great. We know that there were 10 communities accepted at the end of 2016. We're really excited and watching out for what plans those communities come up with. But that doesn't stop us from needing to continue past the current round of youth homelessness demonstration projects. We want to be able to continue to be creative and flexible in housing and urban development, being able to address youth homelessness as well. So what are we talking about when we're talking about fiscal year 2018 and funding? We went through that same issue with the budget cap being lifted for 2016-2017 fiscal years. So we're looking at right now the President's fiscal year 2018 quote-unquote skinny budget, which will be released hopefully next week, and with details really parsed out later in the spring. So it'll be that bare bones kind of here's the high level that we'll be able to see soon, and then it'll start getting fleshed out later in spring is what that really looks like. Okay, so Congress will likely be able to handle this after the fiscal year 2017 appropriations are finished in April. So we want to start getting folks geared up to start thinking about it and start talking about what direction we think that they need to move in. So what direction is that? You want to address you want to ask your legislators to address in your personal letter to the Appropriations Committee, please request the following. So we want for Health and Human Services $165 million for Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funded programs, right? Because obviously we know 119 hasn't really been cutting it. We want to increase that $77 million to $85 million for the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. And again, we want to maintain that additional $7 million for Housing and Urban Development Youth Homelessness Demonstration Projects and ask for an even $40 million. So those specific requests, as of right now, it's pretty early on, so we're asking for them to be open and willing to sign on to a Dear Colleague letter that will support all of these requests. We will have more information on the House and Senate. In particular, that $165 million for our HYA funded programs is the last specified amount for our HYA in the 2008 reauthorization. We'll talk about reauthorization and the current status of our HYA in just a couple minutes. So this program, again, you really want to reiterate, targets that youth-specific housing and services resources for communities at the local level. It's important to get that at the local level in there since we are community-based organizations. We have a need to point out, again, that combination where the rubber meets the road of human trafficking and youth homelessness, and especially our street outreach programs being truly the front lines preventing and serving those victims, and then how we can prevent youth from abusing substances or get them referrals to treatment programs for especially heroin and opioids is big in this Congress's vocabulary and in the forefront of their minds. That $85 million for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth programs. As we said before, it was one of the few programs to already have received an increase, but it hasn't quite been enough. We're continuing to see the numbers climb, and so it's still really important that we are helping programs in public schools be able to fill the need, and for local education liaisons and state educational agencies to be able to have the capacity to truly do their work. So the $40 million, again, for those youth homelessness demonstration projects, this is all the same information that you've already gotten. So I'm not going to belabor the point too much right here. But this would give Housing and Urban Development the incentive to continue funding youth-appropriate housing and services like we were talking about before. So the background of the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act reauthorization. So the act actually expired back in 2013 and needs to be reauthorized. It has been, we updated it in 2014, in the 2014 vote, the last time that it was up for reauthorization, and we currently need it to pass through both houses of Congress. So previously, it was Senate Bill 262, which was introduced in January of 2015 by Senator Leahy, who's a Democrat from Vermont, as well as Collins, who's a Republican from Maine. And they were really hugely instrumental in helping us gain co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle, as well as Ayotte from New Hampshire and Booker from New Jersey. In the House, we had House Resolution 1779, which was introduced in April of 2015. This was also brought in by bipartisan sponsorship and ended up with 32 co-sponsors. So the specific requests here will be to co-sponsor the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act. So it's now RHY TPA. Again, we're really trying to hone in on that intersection of youth homelessness and trafficking prevention. So we expect to have many of the same sponsors. We will have I'll have a slide in here about who those previous sponsors were in just a second. And then we will need a Dear Colleague letter to be circulated for co-sponsorship as well. Here's that slide that I was talking about. These are our previous Senate co-sponsors of the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act. These folks are all still around. I do want to point out that there is an additional Senate representative who had been a congressional representative from the House previously. House Representative Duckworth is now in the Senate. So you can find Duckworth's information online, and remind, if you see anybody from your own state on this list, you just want to remind them in a very friendly manner that they had previously sponsored this particular legislation. Here are those same names from the House. There have been 2 folks that were replaced that are no longer in the U.S. House of Representatives. That was Representative Jolly from the 13th District in Florida, has been replaced with Charlie Crist. Again, that's the 13th District in Florida. So you can find that information online, and you want to remind, or you want to let that person know that that district that they're representing has historically been supportive of this legislation. And that also goes for the 13th District of New York. Amazingly enough, we both had 13th districts from the North and the South who had been replaced. The 13th District in New York had previously been, assuming it's Rangel, and that is replaced by Adriano Espalat. Again, that's the 13th District of New York. So 13th District of New York and Florida have both been replaced, and you just want to reach out to those folks and remind them that historically your district has been very supportive of this legislation. So what are our big talking points? The big talking points in here are going to be about the key updates, the updated language that had currently been in the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. So that includes some new provisions on combating trafficking and discrimination. We are trying to increase the length of stay in basic centers from 21 to 30 days because we know sometimes that 3 weeks bare minimum is just not quite enough to do the family reunification work that really needs to be done to safely return a young person, or to allow the safe return of a young person to home. And then we are looking at requiring our HYA grantees to assist youth with completing, and this actually isn't just completing the free application for federal student aid, it's actually connecting them with educational services. So part of it is completing the free application for federal student aid, but it's about more than that. It's about being able to verify that student going into higher education is actually eligible for as being an unaccompanied homeless youth, so that they don't have to access their parents' tax information or whatever the case may be. And we can help provide more information on that if there's any confusion around it. But and then we also really want to point out that these programs have been vital to scaling up youth-centric community responses to youth homelessness. Without runaway and homeless youth folks at the table, at the local community table, most communities have had a really hard time figuring out how to incorporate youth experiencing homelessness into the services that they do have available to them. So So moving on to Policy Act number 3, the Homeless Children and Youth Act. Currently, we're calling it HCYA. Background, previously it was bipartisan and bicameral, which means that it had both Republican and Democratic sponsors, as well as being identical as introduced in the Senate and the House. So it was first introduced by Senators Feinstein and Portman, and introduced in the House by Stivers and Lobsack. We originally previously had 413 organizations supporting the Homeless Children and Youth Act, which is a huge number, and is really persuasive when we're talking to legislators that represent a lot of the states and local communities which signed on in support of this legislation. So there were 61 national organizations that had signed on as well. So what does the Homeless Children and Youth Act do? It really amends Housing and Urban Development's definition of homelessness to include children and youth that have been verified by school liaisons, by RHY programs, Head Start programs, Healthcare for the Homeless, as homeless, as currently experiencing homelessness. It takes away the ability of Housing and Urban Development here in DC as a big federal agency from prioritizing one group over another at the local level. So it really gives kind of that power back to local communities to be able to do their own needs assessment and decide what priorities they need according to their own assessments. And then it requires data from all federal partners and all homeless programs to be a part of what's called the annual homelessness assessment report that Housing and Urban Development gives to Congress every year. And then it requires grantees serving families and youth to connect participants with educational services. So this goes back to kind of that same, we wanted to have really the same kind of requirements from both RHY programs as well as HUD funded programs, to have that mandate to really make sure that all youth participants are being connected with really crucial educational services. And a big piece of that is that federal financial aid application. Okay. So what does the Homeless Children and Youth Act not do? We've heard a lot of myths from the last time that it was introduced about it opening the floodgates and taking away funding and services from one group for another. Well, we can definitively say that because of the emphasis on giving the power back to local communities to triage what their true needs at that local level are, it does not take funding away or services away from one population or people who are chronically homeless. It allows that local community to really look and say, hey, we've done a really good job with this population. Maybe we don't need this surplus of money that's there right now, but we are seeing an influx of this other population, and maybe it's not even youth and families that they're seeing the influx in, right? But it allows all of that to be done, and that decision making to be done at the local level without fear of not necessarily retaliation, but of losing points on the next grant cycle or whatever the case may be. So it doesn't contain any expensive new studies or data collection, as we just discussed. It really just pings all of the other federal agencies that are already collecting all of this information from the folks that they serve, and puts it all in one place. So really the only additional step is, instead of them just reporting it up the ladder in their own agency, they now report it over to Housing and Urban Development too. And when we're talking about that data collection, we're talking about aggregate data. We're not talking about any information that would violate confidentiality or require identifying information to be released. So, and then lastly, again, it's not flooding the system or overwhelming existing resources. Just because we're simply saying that these particular youth and families should qualify as homeless and should be considered for the programs that are available in the community doesn't mean that they are all going to, right? If we have a 16-year-old who's been on the street for a month and a bed opens up and we've got the kid who's experiencing early conflict issues with their family, that community should be able to say, yes, the young person who's been on the street for a month needs the bed, but we do have family reunification or family services that can be offered in home to help with the family conflict issue that's going on in the other family. But right now, it's not necessarily the case that those decisions can be made depending on who's actually presenting for services on what days. So part of that Homeless Children and Youth Act, we want to point out who our previous Senate co-sponsors have been, so that if you see folks from your state, you can thank them for supporting it in the past, remind them that they've supported it in the past, and encourage them to co-sponsor again. And then in the House, same thing. All of these folks are still around, so make sure that you take the time, again, thank them for their past support and ask them for support moving forward and sponsorship. So your specific talking points, you really want to hone in on the housing and urban development definition eligibility barrier and how that would be eliminated, which would make youth eligible to be served in our HYA programs. It would make the youth that are eligible to be served in those programs eligible for the housing and urban development programs as well. And it takes away the ability for HUD to impose their priorities if it does not meet the local needs assessment of the community in terms of populations and housing models, right? So again, going back to really giving the power back to the local community, taking it out of Washington, D.C., as we know with National Network for Youth, sometimes we think something's a priority and then we reach out to local community providers and find out that, no, actually we had it backwards. And so really there's nobody better suited to assess what your community needs than the people that are in your community. I know that seems very intuitive, but sometimes it's counterintuitive when you're here actually in D.C. And then really allowing HUD programs to become efficient in connecting young people with education, because right now that's not, that hasn't really been a point where HUD programs have really been pushed super hard. And so we're really hoping that will continue to encourage HUD's development of services that young people really need. So final parting advice, I wanted to give you all a chance to tell me if there are things that you have experienced when you have come to DC in the past. You can go ahead and use the chat box to type those in. While folks are thinking about that, I wanted to leave you with a quote that I have always found particularly important and inspirational when thinking about going in and sitting down with policymakers in their leadership roles. There are leaders and there are those who lead us. Leaders hold a position of power or authority, but those who lead inspire us. We follow those who lead, not because we have to, but because we want to. So what I'm saying is, while you might be sitting down with a policymaker thinking that they're a leader, you are the ones who lead everyone else because you are the inspiration. I'm looking up in the chat box. I'm not seeing anybody with any advice or any stories that you have engaged in or that you've taken away from previous advocacy that you might have done. But let's see, does anybody have questions? And you can ask specific questions about anything that we've covered, any bills that you may have heard of outside of these 3 policy asks that we gave you. I do want to also point out that while you're in your meetings, it's totally okay to not know, even though I said that you all are the experts in the room, because you are. Very few legislators have ever even worked in a runaway and homeless youth program, let alone run one or engaged in one. So it's okay to be the expert in the room and still not know an answer specifically. If that does come up, feel free and please do refer that legislator or their staff or their aides to National Network for Youth, and we are happy to field questions that come out of that. Okay, if there are no questions, then I would like to thank everybody for your time, and hopefully this has been informative. I know there's the resource guide that went out as well, so feel free to contact me, Amy Loudit, at National Network for Youth, or Eric Maston, our Director of Public Policy, and one of the two of us will work feverishly to make sure that we are responsive to you as soon as possible. We want to make sure everybody's really ready for this. It's going to be a really important year for us to have a solid voice. Okay. There are our email addresses. I'm going to leave this open for a little bit in case somebody has questions that they are still trying to formulate or come up with, and then I will close it down at 5 o'clock Eastern time. Thanks, everyone.